Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really significant legal and political battle brewing right now.
Yeah, it's happening between the federal government and, well, a whole lot of cities and counties across the country.
That's right. And at its heart, this deep dive is all about this clash over immigration enforcement policies.
Specifically, we're zeroing in on these jurisdictions often called sanctuary areas. It's creating some real tension locally.
Definitely impacting communities. And for this, we're going straight to the source material you provided us.
Right, that includes a big legal complaint filed by a bunch of these cities and counties.
Yeah, laying out their arguments, what federal actions they're actually challenging.
And we also have a statement from a county executive responding to being labeled, a sanctuary, plus excerpts from the EOs and other federal stuff.
So our mission here is really to cut through the noise.
Yep. We'll break down the federal approach as these documents describe it.
Understand exactly why these local places are pushing back so hard.
And explore the potential real-world impacts of this whole conflict.
All strictly based on the sources you've shared. No taking sides, just unpacking the info.
Exactly. So where should we start? The federal strategy.
Yeah, let's kick off with the federal approach as these sources lay it out. They point specifically to two executive orders from early this year.
EO 44159, that was January 20th, and EO 14218 from February 19th.
And the stated goal, according to what we read, seems pretty clear.
Yeah, it's about ensuring the faithful execution of immigration laws, explicitly targeting individuals deemed inadmissible and removable aliens.
So the focus is definitely on enforcement and removal.
Right. And a key part of this is targeting what the federal government defines as sanctuary jurisdictions.
Now, this definition in EO 14159 seems, well, broader than maybe before.
It does. It calls them jurisdictions that seek to interfere with the lawful exercise of federal law enforcement operations. That's pretty broad language.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because that new definition seems, I don't know, deliberate.
The sources definitely suggest that. It looks like it might be designed to get around previous court rulings on an older EO 13768.
So maybe that one faced challenges because the definition was narrower.
That seems to be the implication. They may be adapting based on past legal fights, trying to capture more local policies with this new wording.
And a major tool they're using, highlighted in the sources, is money, withholding federal funds.
Absolutely. Directing the Attorney General and the DHS Secretary to block funds going to these targeted jurisdictions. EO 14218 is pretty explicit about making sure federal money doesn't, quote, abet these policies.
And it's not just about the money, is it? The sources also mention legal action.
Right. EO 14159 talks about evaluating and even pursuing criminal or civil action against places whose practices are seen as interfering with federal immigration enforcement.
Wow. So potentially suing cities or counties.
That seems to be on the table, according to the EO. And we also see specific memos mentioned, like the Bondi memo and the Bove memo.
What do those do?
They direct U.S. attorneys' offices to actually investigate local officials and entities if they don't comply with immigration enforcement requests.
So putting pressure directly on local officials.
Seems like it. The sources say these memos reinforce the federal view that not complying holds up enforcement and could even violate federal law.
The sources also mention some other federal strategies too, right?
Yeah, things like encouraging voluntary departure, trying to get state and local police involved through 287G agreements, though that requires local consent.
Okay.
And increasing the number of ICE deportation officers, aiming for 5,000 more than FY 2013 levels. But that's subject to funding from Congress.
Right. Appropriations matter.
And enhancing information sharing, like adding immigration violators to the big crime database, NCIC.
So it really paints a picture of a multi-pronged federal effort to ramp up enforcement and sort of demand cooperation.
That's definitely the picture presented in these documents, a very concerted push.
All right, so that's the federal side as laid out here. Let's pivot now to the pushback. How are local places responding, and what are their reasons, according to these sources?
Well, we see a pretty strong coalition of cities and counties fighting back.
Yeah, you mentioned San Francisco, Santa Clara, San Diego, Sacramento, Santa Cruz, Monterey, Seattle, New Haven, Minneapolis, Santa Fe. Quite a list.
It is. And they've filed a joint lawsuit challenging these federal moves.
What's crucial to get, I think, is that they have their own policies, their own reasons for doing what they do. It's not just one thing called sanctuary, right?
Exactly. The sources show a range of local approaches, but you see common themes.
Like what?
Well, like San Francisco with its Chapter 12I policy. They emphasize building trust between city workers, including police and health folks, and all residents.
Regardless of immigration status.
Right. Their stated reason is that this trust is vital for public safety overall. People need to feel safe calling 911 or talking to officials without fearing immigration questions.
Makes sense from a community perspective. What about others?
Some, like Sacramento and Santa Cruz, which apparently declared itself a refuge way back in 1986, focus on resources.
Scarce local resources, yeah.
Exactly. Their policies aim to stop local tax money and staff time from being used on what they see as federal civil immigration work. They argue those resources are needed for local crime, schools, roads, core city stuff.
Okay, so trust and resources. What else?
Then you have places like Santa Clara or Seattle with specific rules about ICE detainers. Santa Clara, after a task force look, only honors them for serious or violent felonies under California law.
So not all detainers.
No. And Seattle explicitly says local police see unlawful presence as a civil issue, not criminal, and city employees generally don't ask about status unless legally required. They draw a clear line.
Saying that's not our job.
Pretty much. And places like New Haven, Minneapolis, Santa Fe focus on protecting confidential info, including immigration status, unless the law demands disclosure. Minneapolis even has a separation ordinance.
And San Diego, they're in the lawsuit too.
Their situation, as described, is a bit different. They say they follow federal and state law, including California's SB 54, but their city charter doesn't add extra restrictions on status inquiries or helping federal civil enforcement.
So a real mix of policies, but often touching on trust, resources, and the line between local policing and federal immigration.
That's the picture the sources paint.
Okay, so given these different local stances, what are the main legal arguments they're making in this lawsuit? What's their case?
The big one, right up front, is the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Which comes from the 10th Amendment.
Exactly. The basic idea is the federal government can't just force states or cities to carry out federal programs.
And the cities are saying these federal actions are doing just that?
Yes. They argue the feds are trying to coerce them, using threats of funding cuts and lawsuits, to basically become arms of federal immigration enforcement.
Okay, so that's argument one. What else?
The spending clause is huge here, too. They argue that when Congress attaches conditions to federal money, those conditions have to be related, or germane, to the purpose of the money itself.
Right. Like education funds should have education-related conditions.
Basically.
Yeah.
And the sources say the threat here is to withhold all kinds of federal funding, even for stuff totally unrelated to immigration, like maybe, road repair or health programs.
And they see that as violating the spending clause.
Yes, and they call it unduly coercive. The sources even use that striking phrase, a gun to the head, to describe how coercive they feel it is.
Wow. That's strong language.
It is. And tied to that, they also argue there's a separation of powers issue.
How so?
They claim the president, through these DOs, is essentially trying to create new punishments and funding conditions that Congress itself has considered and rejected.
So arguing the president is stepping into Congress's territory, specifically its power over spending.
That's the claim. They also hit on vagueness.
About the definition of sanctuary jurisdiction.
Yeah. They say that broad definition in EO 14159 is so unclear and lacks standards that it could lead to arbitrary enforcement. Like, who decides what counts as interference?
Creates uncertainty for cities.
Definitely. And finally, they bring up the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA.
Standard procedure for challenging federal agency actions.
Right. Arguing these federal actions are arbitrary, capricious, go beyond the executive branch's legal authority, and weren't done with the proper process.
And they mention past court cases.
They do. They point to previous wins, like cases involving Burn J grants, those are common law enforcement grants, where courts actually stopped the federal government from withholding funds based on similar immigration conditions before.
So they're saying, look, courts have sided with us on similar things already.
That's definitely part of their argument, using that precedent.
Okay, so those are the legal battle lines drawn in the sources. What about the real-world stakes? What could actually happen if these federal funds get cut off, according to these documents?
The impacts described are pretty wide-ranging and hit essential local services.
Like what specifically?
Well, a lot related to public safety. San Francisco and Santa Clara mention cuts to victim services.
Okay.
Emeryville talks about impacts on police gear, body cams, radios. New Haven and Santa Clara mention threats to programs pairing mental health pros with police for crisis calls.
That sounds important.
Yeah, and also violence prevention work. Minneapolis worries about police recruitment and even crime lab functions like DNA testing. New Haven also notes potential hits to police tech and gear.
So direct impacts on law enforcement capacity.
Seems so. But it goes beyond traditional policing, too.
How?
Sources mention potential cuts to community support and youth programs. San Francisco and Santa Clara could lose funding for re-entry programs for former inmates and youth programs aimed at preventing violent crime.
Okay, broader community impacts.
And even infrastructure projects, noted by Minneapolis, and climate change programs in New Haven.
Wow, so really across the board.
It seems like it could touch many different areas. And then there's just the general budget problem.
Just making ends meet becomes harder.
Right. King County says losing federal funds would worsen an existing budget shortfall. New Haven makes a really specific point.
What's that?
That because so much property there is tax exempt, like universities and hospitals over half, 56.8%.
Oh.
It's incredibly hard for them to just raise property taxes to make up for lost federal money. They'd likely face tough choices between service cuts and tax hikes.
And are there other concerns mentioned besides the money?
Yeah, a few. Montgomery County mentions the fear this creates in immigrant communities, which goes back to that trust issue.
Right.
There are also worries cited about legal liability, like could a city get sued for violating someone's constitutional rights if forced to hold them on an ICE detainer without a proper warrant?
That's a serious concern for local governments.
And Montgomery County also voices a view that these federal actions are, in their words, morally and economically reckless.
So what this really boils down to, as the sources show it, is a fundamental disagreement over what public safety means and how best to achieve it, isn't it?
I think that's a fair reading. The federal approach described focuses on enforcing specific laws against specific people,
While the local jurisdictions argue their policies also promote public safety, but in a different way.
Exactly. By building trust so everyone feels safe interacting with local authorities, reporting crimes, accessing services, they see that broad community trust as essential for safety.
So, wrapping this up, this deep dive into your source material really highlights a major clash.
Yeah, a significant legal and practical fight. It's not just about immigration policy itself.
No, it's about who's responsible for enforcement and, crucially, how much power the federal government has to compel local help using the leverage of funding.
It really puts the tension between federal goals and local autonomy front and center, and how different levels of government define, public well-being.
So here's something to think about, a final thought based on all this. If local governments feel pushed into a corner, choose between federal immigration demands that they believe harm community trust and divert local resources, or lose federal money needed for core local safety programs like victim support or police initiatives.
Yeah.
What does that choice ultimately mean for the safety and well-being of all the people living in their communities? It really raises a big question about how these federal actions ripple down and affect the very mission of local government, which is supposed to serve everyone within its borders.